My father didn't come to my wedding because he said my fiancée wasn't good enough for our family name. He said it at the dinner table on a Thursday night in February, while my mother was passing the bread and my brother was checking his phone. He said it the way he said most things, casually, like he was commenting on the weather outside, like the words didn't have weight, like I wasn't sitting 3 feet away from him. "She's a nice enough girl," he said. But you know how people talk. I remember the sound of sleet against the kitchen window. I remember the overhead light that always flickered when the heat kicked on. I remember my mother setting down the bread basket very slowly, like she was being careful not to drop something fragile. And I remember thinking, he actually believes this. He isn't performing cruelty. He genuinely believes he's being reasonable. That was the part that stayed in my bloodstream for years. My name is Owen. I grew up in a small city in northern Ontario, the kind of place where everyone's father either worked the mill, the mine, or ran a trade. My father ran a small construction company, residential builds mostly. He'd started it himself in his early 30s and never let any of us forget it. The company wasn't large by any measure, maybe 8 full-time guys at peak season, but to him it represented something enormous. It represented proof that he was serious, that he had built something with his hands, that he had earned the right to have opinions about everyone else. He had 2 sons. My older brother Kyle was everything my father wanted in a firstborn. He was loud in the right rooms, confident the way men my father admired were confident, the kind of confidence that didn't require intelligence to sustain itself, just volume and a firm handshake. Kyle played rep hockey until he blew out his knee at 19, which my father quietly mourned, as though something had been taken from him personally. After that, Kyle drifted into sales, then into half-finished plans, then into a position at my father's company, doing something that was never quite explained to anyone. Then there was me. I was the quiet one. I was the one who read too much, who spent weekends taking apart old laptops and putting them back together, who got into the University of Waterloo for computer science at 17, and heard my father tell his brother at a family barbecue, genuine, without lowering his voice, "I don't know what he thinks he's going to do with that." I didn't correct him. Even then, I understood something about people like my father. They reveal themselves most honestly when they believe you're listening, but not worth responding to. University changed me in ways I still can't fully describe. Not the coursework exactly, though that was its own world. What changed me was the first time I sat in a room full of people who were exactly as serious as I was and didn't find it strange, who stayed up until 2 in the morning not because they had to, but because the problem in front of them was genuinely interesting. I wasn't the odd one anymore, I was just one of many. I worked part-time through school doing IT support, then freelance web development under a username I never connected to my real name. My father mocked remote work the one time I mentioned it. Internet money, he called it. Good luck paying a mortgage with internet money. So I stopped mentioning it, and I kept earning. By my 3rd year, I was making more in a weekend than he was paying Kyle to show up 3 days a week. But I said nothing. I filed it away the way I filed everything, quietly, carefully, without anyone watching. I met Nadia in my final year of school. She was doing her MBA, sharp and straightforward in a way that made most people slightly nervous. She was from Sudbury. Her parents were both school teachers. She drove a 10-year-old Civic and didn't apologize for it. I loved her immediately and without confusion, which was new for me. Most things in my life had required careful analysis before I trusted them. Nadia was different. Some things you simply know. I brought her home for Thanksgiving in the 2nd year we were together. My mother liked her right away. I could tell from the way she kept touching her arm while they talked. The way she laughed genuinely at something Nadia said about a patient she'd worked with during her clinical placement. My mother was always the reader in that house, always the one who understood nuance. She just learned not to express it too loudly. My father was polite that weekend in the performative way he was polite to people he'd already decided didn't matter. He asked Nadia what her father did for work. When she said teacher, something shifted almost imperceptibly behind his eyes. Not contempt exactly, more like a reclassification. She'd been filed, I noticed. I always noticed. I just didn't say anything. When I proposed to Nadia, on a Tuesday morning actually, over coffee in our apartment in Waterloo, because she'd said once that she found big gestures exhausting, she said yes before I'd finished the sentence. We set the date for the following September. Church ceremony in Sudbury, her hometown. Small, maybe 60 people. Exactly what both of us wanted. I told my family at Christmas. My father's reaction was a silence that lasted about 4 seconds longer than it should have. Then he said, "Sudbury's a long drive." Then he asked Kyle if he wanted another beer. My mother said she was happy for me. She said it quietly, looking at the tablecloth, in a way that meant she was happy for me, and also sorry about something she couldn't name. 3 weeks later was the dinner where he said it. About the family name. About how people talk. Nadia wasn't there. I was visiting alone, which in retrospect was the only reason he said it out loud. He'd always been slightly more careful when she was in the room. With me alone, he didn't bother editing himself. I looked at him across the table for a moment. The flickering light, the sleet on the window. Okay, I said. Not because I agreed. Because I had learned over 26 years in that house that agreeing with him was the fastest way to end a conversation and the most efficient way to preserve energy for things that mattered. I drove home that night and I told Nadia what he'd said. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "What do you want to do?" I said I didn't know yet. That was true in the moment. But somewhere underneath the not knowing, something had already made a decision. The same part of me that watched him carefully for years, that listened while he talked about things he didn't understand, that filed everything away in silence, that part had already begun to plan. My father came to the wedding, or rather he did not. We sent the invitations in April, formal ones, to every family member on both sides. My father received his on a Tuesday. On Friday of that week he called me, not to congratulate, not to discuss travel arrangements, but to tell me that he and Kyle weren't going to be able to make it. Something about a project deadline. A build in Timmins that couldn't wait. My mother called me 20 minutes later, crying in the quiet way she cried, like she was trying to do it without taking up any space. She was going to come, she said. She would drive herself if she had to. I told her I would handle her travel and accommodation, and she wasn't to worry about any of it. The morning of my wedding, I walked across the lawn of the small venue outside Sudbury with Nadia's father, who had spent the previous night teaching me a card trick he'd learned 40 years ago, who smelled like cedar and Old Spice, who shook my hand at the door of the ceremony and said, "Welcome to the family, son," in a tone that had no performance in it at all. My family section had 3 people: my mother, my aunt from Thunder Bay who made the drive overnight, and my cousin who was 17 and had borrowed a tie that was too long for him. My father's seat was empty, so was Kyle's. I looked at those empty chairs once, during the processional. Then I looked at Nadia, and I didn't look at the chairs again. The applause in the room when we were pronounced married was warm and real. My mother was crying openly now, not hiding it. Nadia's parents were holding hands. Afterward, someone took a photo of me and Nadia on the steps outside. I look at that photo sometimes. You can see in it exactly what that day was: uncomplicated joy, without the asterisk of people who needed to diminish it. On the drive back from the reception, my phone showed one message from my father. It said, "Hope it went well." I set the phone face down on the center console and drove home. Something settled in me that night. Not bitterness exactly, something quieter, a kind of clarity about what I was working toward and who it was for. I had spent enough years angling my ambitions in the direction of his approval, performing competence in his vocabulary, hoping he'd eventually look up and see me. That night, I stopped, completely and without drama. I simply turned the energy inward, toward the life I was actually building, and left the old version of the hope behind like something I'd outgrown. Over the next 4 years, I built. Nadia finished her MBA and took a position as a financial analyst in Kitchener. We bought a house in a quiet neighborhood near Victoria Park, the kind of house where the floors creak specifically in the spots that tell you it's been lived in. I started a small cybersecurity consulting firm, just me at first, registered quietly in my own name, and began taking contracts with mid-sized companies across Ontario and Alberta who needed compliance assessments and infrastructure audits. Most clients never met me in person. They knew my work arrived on time, was thorough, and solved problems they'd been unable to solve internally. I built my reputation the same way I built everything, not loudly. Within 18 months, I'd brought on 2 contractors. Within 3 years, I had a full team of 6. We weren't a large firm by Bay Street standards, but we were profitable, debt-free, and growing at a rate that made my accountant, a careful woman in Waterloo who expressed enthusiasm only in very small quantities, describe our position as genuinely solid. I didn't tell my family any of this. My father assumed, as far as I could tell, that I was doing computer stuff. His phrase had never evolved, for some company somewhere, collecting a reasonable salary, probably renting an apartment, the house, the business, the contracts. None of it appeared in any conversation because he never asked. He talked about Kyle's newest venture at every family event, something in real estate development which shifted shape slightly every time it was described. And I would nod and pass the potatoes and think about the audit I had to finish by Thursday. My mother knew something was different. She mentioned it once, carefully, after dinner at Christmas when we were washing dishes together, and everyone else had moved to the living room. She said, "You seem settled." I told her things were going well. She looked at me for a moment and then said, "I'm glad," in a way that meant more than the words. Then one evening in March, Nadia was reading on the couch when I got off a call with my accountant. I sat down and stared at the middle distance for a minute. She looked up. "What?" she said. "Dad's company is in trouble," I said. I'd learned it the way I learned most things. Not from him, but from information available to anyone who knew where to look. Provincial court records. Supplier forums. A conversation that reached me through a former colleague who knew someone in Timmins. My father's construction business had been contracting steadily for 2 years. A major residential project outside of North Bay had gone over budget and into dispute. 2 subcontractors had filed liens. The bank had begun the process of reviewing a line of credit that my father had apparently been using, in ways that were not entirely transparent, to keep Kyle's real estate venture from fully collapsing. Nadia set her book down. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," I said. That was honest. But the honest thing and the prepared thing are not the same thing, and I had been prepared for something like this for longer than I could clearly articulate. I contacted my attorney the following week. I reviewed everything, our holdings, our liabilities, the cleanness of our records. Nothing that affected us. Nothing that reached us. Good, then I waited. My father called for the first time on a Wednesday in April, late enough that I almost didn't answer. His voice was different from the first syllable. Still his voice, the same cadence, the same slight gravel, but the architecture had changed. The scaffolding of authority he'd built into every sentence for my entire life was simply not there. "I've been meaning to call," he said. I waited. Things have been a bit complicated on the business side. I waited. "Kyle mentioned you might be doing well." What you're doing?" I sat very still in my home office while he spoke. Outside the window, the street was quiet. One of those early spring nights where the air smells like cold water and new mud. I listened to him describe numbers and timelines and institutional problems in the careful, managed way a proud man describes things that humiliate him. He didn't ask directly. Not yet. He talked around it the way water moves around something solid, testing every edge before committing to a direction. When he finally stopped talking, I said, "I'll come up next week," he said. "That would be good." I drove up on a Saturday. The house looked smaller than I remembered houses look when the person who filled them with authority is diminished. The expensive truck in the driveway had a crack in the windshield that hadn't been repaired. The front steps still had last winter's salt residue on them. My mother opened the door before I knocked. She hugged me the way she hugged me when I left for university, like she was storing it for later. Inside, Kyle was in the living room, looking at his phone. He nodded at me. He didn't make a joke. That by itself told me everything I needed to know about how bad things were. My father was at the kitchen table. When I walked in, he looked up. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. He looked older, not in a dramatic way. In the way people look when they've been carrying something they won't put down because putting it down would require admitting how heavy it was. "Good drive?" he said. "Fine," I said. I sat down across from him. He spread some papers on the table. Bank letters, contractor invoices, a summary document from his accountant that he'd printed, and now spread between us like a map of a territory he'd lost. I looked at each one carefully and said nothing. My expression, I made sure, was the same expression I used in client meetings. Interested, neutral, impossible to read as judgment, he explained. The North Bay project had been the beginning, a client dispute that escalated. Legal fees he'd funded by drawing further on the line of credit. Kyle's involvement in a side deal that had not returned the capital it was supposed to. A supplier who'd stopped extending credit. The bank's position, which was now considerably less patient than it had been 18 months ago. When he finished, the kitchen was very quiet. I looked at the papers for another moment. Then I looked at him. "You didn't come to my wedding," I said. He blinked. I think he expected different first words from me. Numbers, maybe. Questions about the timeline. "Not that. Owen, I'm not bringing it up to punish you," I said. "I just want to say it clearly once, so it's said. You didn't come to my wedding. You told my mother Nadia wasn't good enough for our family name. And I heard you." I paused. "Now I'm listening to what you need, and I'm going to decide what I can do. Those are both true at the same time." He was quiet for what felt like a long time. Kyle had appeared in the doorway, and I could feel him standing there without looking at him. My father said, "You're right. 2 words, performance." Just 2 words he'd clearly never expected to say to me about anything. I looked at the papers again. "Here's what I can do," I said. I didn't offer everything. That was deliberate, and I had thought about it carefully with Nadia over the previous 2 weeks, because I'd wanted to be sure I wasn't acting from anger or from the exhausted desire to finally be needed by someone who'd never needed me before. What I offered was specific and conditional. I could bring the contractor liens current, 2 of them, the ones that were creating the most immediate legal exposure, through a third-party payment structure that my attorney had already drafted. I was not willing to absorb Kyle's real estate losses. That was a separate problem and not mine to solve. And going forward, my father would work with a financial advisor of my choosing, with full access, no hidden accounts, no further decisions of scale without review. Those are my conditions, I said. You don't have to accept them. Kyle made a sound in the doorway, not quite a word. I turned and looked at him directly for what might have been the first time as an adult. I'm not speaking to you right now, I said. Not unkindly, just clearly. He went back to the living room. My father looked at the table. Then he said, "That's fair." What happened afterward was not clean. It was never going to be clean. My father settled into a version of himself I didn't fully recognize, less loud, more careful, paying genuine attention when I spoke in a way he'd never managed before. It wasn't transformation. Men in their 60s with 50 years of practiced authority don't transform. What they do sometimes, if they're honest enough, is adjust. He adjusted, slowly and imperfectly, but genuinely. Kyle and I found a wary kind of détente. He stopped performing around me once it became clear I wasn't impressed by performances. We spoke occasionally on the phone. Brief, transactional conversations that slowly, over months, started to include the occasional actual sentence. Once, he called to tell me that he'd gotten a job with a property management company. Legitimate employment, full-time. He mentioned it quickly, casually, like it wasn't significant, in the way men mention things that are very significant to them. I told him that was good. I meant it. My mother came to visit us in Kitchener twice that year. The first time, she spent an afternoon in our kitchen with Nadia, while I worked in the back office, and I could hear them laughing at something I couldn't make out, and the sound of it was so uncomplicated, it almost caught me off guard. The second time, she stayed for 4 days. Before she left, she found me in the backyard in the early morning. I wake up early, always have. And she sat next to me on the back steps with a cup of tea and said, "You turned out well. I don't say that enough." I told her she said it plenty. She said, "I should have said it louder when it mattered." I didn't have anything to add to that. Sometimes the honest thing is the only thing. And adding to it diminishes it. We sat there for a while in the early morning, the yard still cold, the maple at the back fence just beginning to show the first green of spring. It was enough. I still think about the morning of my wedding sometimes. I think about walking across the lawn with Nadia's father, about the card trick the night before, about how my aunt drove overnight from Thunder Bay and showed up with a wrapped gift and a travel mug and not a single complaint. I think about those empty chairs and how I looked at them once and then looked away and didn't look back. For a long time, I thought success would arrive as noise. I thought the moment my father understood what I'd built would be some kind of culminating scene. Confrontational, cathartic, the kind of moment that resolves things the way movies resolve things, cleanly and completely. I imagined him seeing the numbers in the company name, and finally understanding something he'd failed to understand for years. But life rarely resolves like that. And the actual moment, him at the kitchen table, spreading papers he was ashamed of, saying "you're right" with no scaffolding around it, that moment was quieter than anything I'd imagined and more complicated. There was no triumph in it that I could cleanly feel. What I felt was closer to grief, actually, for the years we'd lost to his certainty about who I was. And underneath the grief, something steadier, the knowledge that I had built exactly the life I intended to build, without his approval, without his involvement, without ever making myself smaller to fit the shape he'd reserved for me. I didn't become successful to correct him. I became successful because the morning I watched my brother laugh at my graduation gown, hanging by the door, and my father button his expensive coat and walk out. That morning I understood that waiting for permission to take your own life seriously is the longest and loneliest way to live it. The empty chair at my wedding taught me the same thing, one more time, louder. I've stopped needing it to be said again.